The crises that have emerged in the West in the 21st century are by and large the products of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism has been taken to its extreme and is no longer useful to the ruling classes of the West in a long-term sense. By neoliberalism, I mean the singular direction the West has moved in consistently for 50 years. It means the logic of the market being treated as something which cannot be negotiated with, globalization and free trade with the free movement of capital, deregulation, privatizing public institutions and public spaces, crushing labor unions and any other voice of workers. In short, it is the reassertion of the primacy of the market, especially the big banks and the big corporations, over the state and everything else. Neoliberalism is no longer in the interests of the ruling class and has come to produce existential crises. But the West can escape from these crises by reasserting the power of the state over that of the markets. That is, by reasserting the national security interests of the West over global financial and corporate interests which are contingent on an obsolete world system. First, it is necessary to understand what neoliberalism fundamentally is and the crises it has produced, and then we shall understand to what specific ends the state needs to become stronger. Do I dislike neoliberalism? I don't really deal in liking or disliking things like neoliberalism, or at least I try my best not to. I prefer to look at the direction things will have to go in regardless of whether anyone likes them. Maybe the leaders in the West like things the way they are. If so, that's great for them and they should keep it up. I really don't care, and it doesn't matter what I think anyway. But anyone can see that the West is declining. It is losing its power internationally while facing destabilization domestically, where these traditional leaders have lost their political authority. The West is facing housing crises, inflation, stagnant wages, massive debt, manufacturing in the hands of its arch-rival China, resulting in a shrinking middle class and a ruined working class, producing mass discontent. They're losing their grip on the global South. Global South countries on every continent are rejecting the West, frequently in favor of better deals with China and Russia. Society is being destabilized by a fragmentation of truth and ideology thanks to the polarizing algorithms of social media. It's being destabilized by climate change. Conspiracy theories have gone completely mainstream. Support for the traditional politicians and their public institutions is plummeting, while support for demagogue con men with bad skin and bad hair is skyrocketing. Birth rates are falling, as is enlistment in the military, and I could go on and on and on. Most, if not all, of what I have just said can ultimately be traced back to the idea that the big banks and big corporations made all of these things happen and that it's not the state's role to interfere. Big tech should run social media algorithms how they want to without interference. Oil companies should just keep drilling endlessly without interference. Hollywood should have all of its films emptied of their content and written by cynical focus groups without interference. These corporations should cause massive chaos, extreme polarization, and an erosion of every sort of necessary social cohesion and collective sense of ideology and truth without interference, because that is what freedom means now. So in the face of all of that, what I say is that the future obviously belongs to what we currently call authoritarianism. Not should, not I want it to. It just does. No one wants to believe that, and they tend to dismiss things that they don't want to believe. They have been taught from birth that good always prevails in the end because God wants it to, and they don't want the whole world to become more like China and Russia. But China and Russia are rising because their states are strong enough that they aren't just the pathetic, helpless slaves of these market forces. And they're taking advantage of the neoliberal international order that the U.S. set up, a system which is also letting the rest of the world run off in their direction. I think the state can only keep accepting this notion for so long, the notion that it should watch its national security be put in deadly peril without interference. The Western powers can either go in this same direction of a stronger state that Russia and China have, or they can continue to recede. Even in that case, they'll probably become more illiberal over time anyway. The free ride cannot last forever. And I don't believe liberal democracy needs to die. I believe it can survive. But it will not be liberal democracy as we know it anymore. It will be much more illiberal by our current standards. And liberal democracy, as we have come to understand the concept, is only one fragment of America's whole existence anyway. America didn't always have free trade or social media, and it used to be much more illiberal in many ways. So I think we just need to adjust our expectations. The International Order of Free Trade was built according to a unipolar global domination by the United States. This in turn was a product of the Cold War, which introduced the notion of eradicating communism because it is evil and the enemy of freedom. This was the first time in history that it was believed that one country should rule the planet. Prior to that, the world had always been multipolar, made up of a multitude of great powers who voluntarily shared a balance of power and pursued their own national interests or their empire's interests. And this is what the world will return to now that the global landscape has clearly become multipolar. The US no longer dominates the world. Russia and China have great influence and alliances on every continent. America must pivot towards accepting this reality and shoring up its own geopolitical interests. This would require replacing the ideology of international liberalism with the ideology of international realism. This does not mean liberalism itself would disappear, only the attitudes and strategies around it would have to change in accordance with realism. What do I mean by this? There are two different perspectives on liberalism we're dealing with that I want to decouple. That liberalism is actually true and we therefore must build a world according to those principles, and that liberalism is false, but a useful lie which helps maintain the system. The former perspective is called liberalism, and the latter perspective is called realism, and those are entirely different, mutually exclusive things. Liberals and realists do not agree with each other. And the system has become filled with liberals because of the fall of the USSR. The liberal international order has been based on liberalism. It has made a lot of assumptions about other Western countries being America's friends, and not just outwardly, but they believed it themselves, while realists have always said that there are no friends in geopolitics, even if we pragmatically call each other friends. Much of the US's early hostility towards communism in the 1950s was also driven by liberals who were waging an ideological crusade. But that wasn't Kissinger. Henry Kissinger, who was the Secretary of State in the 1960s and the 1970s, he simply believed in whatever would create a stable system and advance the US's interests. He was a hard realist. If Kissinger was committed to liberalism, he would have called China an evil terrorist rogue state. I'm using today's neoliberal era parlance to make a point. A rogue state that would be upsetting the international order, this world of friends. But instead, he behaved exactly the way the other realists I mentioned behaved. The rival empires or rival great powers cooperate with one another in maintaining their balance of power and doing whatever they want, while the little countries suffer what they must. That perspective horrifies the liberal writers in the geopolitics magazines such as The Economist, while the realists in some of these magazines simply say that Trump is incredibly incompetent and inconsistent at it. The whole concept of social media and the overall optimism there used to be about the internet is liberal. Saying, on the other hand, that no, whatever will be left of social media after the state is strengthened will work the way that television used to work, just pacifying its audience and telling them they have freedom and democracy. That is realist. Theodore Roosevelt was a realist. Theodore Roosevelt expanded the U.S.'s interests by force in the Western Hemisphere while maintaining that balance of power with the other big empires. And although Donald Trump as a statesman leaves so much to be desired compared to a figure like Theodore Roosevelt when it comes to competence or basic strategy, his aggression towards smaller countries and his conciliation with Russia strike me as similar to Theodore Roosevelt and to the whole history of great powers and empires before the introduction of Pax Americana and consequently the atrophying of Western elites. The strengthening of the state is a very spontaneous phenomenon at this stage of neoliberalism's decay, and it has happened globally. It is happening in the West as well, but it is being expressed by the polarized politics of the West, since neither the liberals nor the right have succeeded in explaining the crises of neoliberalism. They can only explain them in partisan terms. The right does not understand why they are strengthening the state. They think it needs to be strengthened because it needs to go after left-wing actors who are producing all of society's problems. But it actually needs to interrupt the logic of the market and go after whoever resists such changes, which are not leftists. They're the large bankers and the corporate actors, by and large. If the right spends more time going after the left instead of going after neoliberalism, then the crises will not end, and the right's demagoguery will only go so far. They will eventually lose power one way or another, provided that the Democratic Party can make a convincing enough case for itself. If the right does go after neoliberalism, then they can claim credit for ending the crises. They may even claim that it was their conservative policies that are responsible for resolving the problem. If I had to guess, though, I would think that the quickest path to victory would be a billionaire funding their own campaign and forcing these changes through. I think back to Franklin D. Roosevelt. He was someone who destroyed the sanctity of market forces. Big business absolutely hated him, even though he was trying to save capitalism from itself. There was even a business plot to assassinate him, which was exposed by Smedley Butler. I also point to Lincoln adopting, similarly to FDR, unprecedented dictatorial powers for his time and using violent force to free millions of slaves with no form of compensation to their owners. So those are two precedents for tearing into the economic basis of the current system to resolve a crisis and convert paralysis and stagnation into restoration of Western power and a revitalized economy. I believe neoliberalism must be torn into similarly, and it will realistically be for the interests of America's national capitalists. It will not be for left-wing reasons like free healthcare or something, although America's workers will most likely benefit just as they did in both of the aforementioned cases. Trump kind of sort of already represents this type of rebellion against neoliberalism, but clearly it would have to be someone else who is actually seriously committed to it. I think Trump is erratic and inconsistent. He's only committed to his own interests and to the show business of it all. I should add that I don't really know if it's possible for this to take place, for this salvation of Western power through a stronger state to occur. I just believe that it's necessary, or else the West will continue to decline. Either the West will save itself, or it will be subordinated to the power of Russia and China, which did embrace the stronger state approach to advance their national interests. It will take the rise of a singular figure, not a Trump, but a Lincoln, a Theodore Roosevelt, an FDR, or a Kissinger, who pierces through the fog of ideology and deals with the true structure of things, saving the Western system from itself.